Welcome, friend, and thank you for settling in for a long, gentle walk through the past. Tonight's tale is a calm, steady narration of the rise, breadth, and fading of the Mongol Empire. How a child of the open steppe grew to command a world of cities and caravan roads, and how that world learned to move goods, ideas, and laws with a regularity that once seemed impossible. There will be no rushing, no drumbeats, only an even voice, unhurried and clear, following the trail from scattered camps to coordinated states, from local rivalries to networks that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. If you wish, allow each paragraph to arrive like a measured footstep, each detail a small lamp along a long, quiet road. The story begins on a vast plain of resilient grass, where clouds travel in long files and horizons refuse to hurry closer. Life here is practical and precise. Each household keeps a felt tent that can be raised and folded without fuss, an inventory of tools whose uses are learned by doing, and herds that are both wealth and responsibility. Children ride almost as soon as they walk, and they learn to notice distances by the way the air looks in late afternoon, and to judge a stranger not by fine words, but by how he treats his horses and how he ties a knot. Into this school of movement and weather came a boy named Temüjin. He learned early to share meat when hunts went well, and to stretch broth when they did not. He learned to aim a short, strong bow while the pony beneath him breathed and turned. He learned the meaning of reliance, that a companion who stands fast in small troubles is the one you want nearby when big ones come. Temüjin's father held a modest authority, enough to influence where the family grazed and who came to their fire. The balance was fragile, and when poison took the father's life, the balance gave way. The family that had been protected by name and obligation found itself exposed to an older arithmetic of survival. Households drifted away. The mother kept the children alive with knowledge counted in handfuls, how to set a snare, how to gather plants that made a meal less thin, how to make a camp feel like safety again after the riders moved on. The boy, alert and patient, remembered who helped and who turned away, and he stored those memories like useful tools for later. Friendship arrived with tests attached. A bride, Berthe, joined Temüjin's life and was taken by raiders soon after, a talon of chaos that would have ended many stories. Instead, the event became proof of method. Temüjin asked for help where he knew he could get it, organized a pursuit that did not wander, and pressed until he recovered her. The rescue was not only a personal victory, it showed observers how he thought. He did not accept the first answer when a second answer might exist. He did not let injury stand unaddressed. He did not indiscriminately punish those who might later be more useful as friends. He measured actions by outcomes and made that measurement visible to others. In those years, the bond between Temüjin and Jamuka, the friend who would later become a rival, taught another lesson, that closeness among ambitious men can produce warmth and friction in alternating seasons. Both saw the possibility of gathering scattered clans into a more predictable whole. Both understood that loyalty could be earned by fairness as well as fear. Where their paths diverged was in the rules they favored and in the kinds of men they wanted to lift upward. Temüjin rewarded steadiness, modest competence, and obedience to procedure. Jamuka, more traditional in some respects, trusted lineage and the older hierarchies. The difference mattered. People who had been overlooked by custom felt the gravity of Temüjin's camp and moved toward it. Reorganization began with clarity. The army was sorted into decimal units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. Commanders were responsible for their numbers and the conduct of their men. Rewards were distributed by rule, not by whim. Loot had an order. Captives were assigned by plan, not by haphazard snatching. The system looked simple on the surface and worked because it was repeated without favoritism. A young archer could look up and understand where he fit and how to rise. The system made the force legible to its own members, which in turn made movements smoother and delays shorter. Law hardened into a routine remembered as the yasa. It was a set of expectations enforced in a military society that wanted predictability more than rhetoric. The rules punished theft and betrayal, discouraged waste in camp and negligence in battle, and standardized practice in ways that reduced quarrels. The law's most important gift was not fear, but regularity. When men know what to expect and what will happen when lines are crossed, they worry less and work more. Regularity made room for speed when it mattered and for rest when it was allowed. It also placed the ruler within a framework, which made obedience feel less like submission to an individual and more like cooperation with a system that usually kept its promises. Communication mattered as much as courage. The yam, relay posts with remounts, rations, and lodging, turned the empire's distances into a problem with a solution. A sealed order could leave one frontier and arrive at another without losing its urgency. Traders with a stamped pass could show it at each station and receive predictable service. Messengers learned to trust the system's habit of readiness. The network created a tempo. Decisions, responses, adjustments, and confirmations moved at a pace that made coordination possible across landscapes that had previously swallowed instructions and blunted intentions.
Religion did not become an obstacle. Temples, monasteries, mosques, and churches had little to fear when they avoided political disruption and paid what was due. Clerics served communities that calmed and educated. Artisans served markets that clothed and fed. The empire's administrative core valued any institution that helped daily life continue. The ruler's favor turned on usefulness and obedience, not on creed, and this tolerance enlisted the cooperation of many who might otherwise have resisted. Early campaigns were lessons in applying a mobile army against fixed obstacles. In the northwest, the Western Xia were tested and found vulnerable when trade routes and supply lines were cut with care. In the north of China, the Jin dynasts possessed walls, granaries, and formations oriented to infantry. The Mongol solution was to borrow and adapt. Siege engineers were retained and respected. Siege engines, traction trebuchets at first, then counterweight trebuchets as knowledge spread, were built and used with patience. Sappers went to work where ladders struggled. Horse archers did not vanish. They screened, harassed, and defended supply lines while the slow work of reducing walls went on. The enemy confronted not only a cavalry storm, but an operational plan that combined mobility with siegecraft in a partnership more dangerous than either alone. When caravans belonging to the Mongols were seized and envoys killed in the Khwarezmian realm, a line was crossed that the ruler in his felt tent had marked clearly. Tamper with trade and you invite total response. The campaign westward came in woven strands. Separate armies moved along different axes and converged when needed, confounding defenders who tried to anticipate where to gather. The shock of Bukhara's occupation, the quiet of Samarkand's workshops continuing under new masters, and the careful resumption of market days after surrenders demonstrated a consistent pattern. Resistance invited demonstration, cooperation invited administration. The empire's preference, visibly, was not endless burning, but lasting order under its own stamp. The campaign to the west also carried learning back toward the center. Administrators of Persian lands knew how to take a census and how to make taxation feel predictable enough that rebellion seemed too costly. Artisans brought skills that intensified production in the core: glass sharper, metal stronger, fabric finer. Doctors and translators followed armies and merchants, bringing with them ideas about health, numbers, and stars. The empire absorbed what kept its edges intact and its roads in repair. Scouting expeditions traced arcs north of the Caucasus and across forests and plains that would later be called by other names. At the Khalkha River, the combination of feigned retreat and controlled violence turned a field of confidence into a field of dispersal. The method was not magic. It depended on discipline, on riders who did not break formation when they turned their horses away, on officers who knew when to hold back and when to wheel and close. The reputation of these methods traveled faster than the riders themselves, and in many places rumor accomplished what arrows might have required the week before. When Temüjin died, secrecy attended his burial. The habit of moving quietly in important matters extended even to the end of a life. What mattered to the empire was less the place of the grave than the force of the structure that survived him. Succession fell to Ogadei, who made Karakorum into a capital that did not need to be apologetic about its nomadic origin. Workshops hammered and turned. Streets were laid with the same plain logic that governed an encampment, only in more permanent materials. Foreign artisans and merchants found recognizable neighborhoods. The court recorded, counted, and dispatched. Ogadei's rule saw the conclusion of the Jin War in the north of China, and to the west, the fields of Europe learned a new arithmetic. The campaign that crossed the Volga and moved through the principalities of the Rus found fortresses that burned, princes that bent, and cities that were counted as tributaries rather than prizes to be held at all times. Batu and Subutai coordinated operations that overcame local bravery with method. At Liegnitz and Mohi, the visiting army fought the battle it wanted to fight and left when its own calendar dictated, withdrawing not because local resistance had proved decisive, but because the empire center demanded attention after Ogadei's death. The lesson was practical. The chain of command mattered more than the intoxication of a fresh road. In China, the southern Song remained. Their rivers and canals demanded that the empire refine its logistics. Pontoon bridges and flotillas joined horse and cart. Gunpowder, already known and used in the region, entered the Mongol toolkit more forcefully as engineers supervised by men who cared about outcomes rather than signatures adopted what worked. Fire lances and bombards at city walls widened the vocabulary of siege, and eventually the Song heartland, step by step, town by town, altered its flags. Kublai Khan emerged from the family's internal disputes as a ruler intent on converting conquest into governance. He established the Yuan dynasty and set Dadu as a capital that could speak in Chinese administrative tones while maintaining inner-Asian priorities. The social order placed Mongols and allied inner-Asian groups above others in the state hierarchy, and the danger of arrogance required regular attention. When governors were fair and disaster relief punctual, tension eased. When corruption festered and requisitions grew careless, petitions thickened and protests gathered around leaders who had the nerve to declare that enough was enough. Paper money spread under the state's guarantee, and the Grand Canal and its tributaries carried the rice that made cities reliable. The bureaucracy was dense enough to be heavy in bad hands and helpful in good ones.
Kublai's ambition on water was mixed. Korea accepted the realities of proximity and adapted court politics to the presence of a large neighbor. Japan did not, and the fleets sent in 1274 and 1281 found both fierce defense and destructive weather. In Dai Viet and Champa, commanders discovered that familiarity with rivers and jungles allowed smaller local forces to shape battles into uncomfortable forms.
The cost-benefit calculation gradually cooled. Expeditions could continue indefinitely, but their returns were unreliable and their demands on supply were steady. The empire remained powerful without insisting on victories that did not pay. Westward, the Ilkhanate took form under Hulagu and his successors. Baghdad fell in 1258, a blow to a long-standing seat of learning and authority. In its place rose a court that increasingly adopted Islam and Persian administrative styles. Rashid al-Din, serving the state, compiled histories that reached far in both time and geography. Ghazan reorganized taxation, minted coins with attention to weight and purity, and reduced some abuses that had discouraged productivity. Experiments with paper currency learned from China faltered under different conditions. The court supported an observatory at Moraga, where astronomers adjusted models of the heavens to better fit observed motion. The tone was rational, not romantic. Law and revenue mattered because they checked the impulses that turn prosperity brittle. The Chagatai domain developed at the frontier where settled oases met steppe pasture. Its stability rested on a compromise that had to be renegotiated often. Nomad elites wanted freedom to move and to enforce old rights. Town dwellers wanted predictability and the low, steady hum of markets. Islam deepened and broadened as a social anchor, and Sufi lodges helped knit communities that might otherwise have remained parallel. Law blended the clarity of the yasa with the interpretive traditions of Islamic jurisprudence, and the blend was neither perfect nor uniform. The story here is one of constant adjustment, and those adjustments left space for later figures to rise. The Golden Horde sat astride riverways and plains, collecting tribute and supervising trade. Sarai became a city with a mixed character, Central Asian in some habits, with European merchants from Genoa and elsewhere mixing in the markets. The Horde's rulers often preferred indirect control over their Slavic tributaries, confirming princes and expecting punctual payment and reliable service. Over time, conversion to Islam altered the music of courtly life and gave the rulers connection to a larger world of law and learning. The arrangement trained local administrations to collect and remit, practices that later centralized states absorbed and modified. Across these realms, trade thickened into a fabric. The Pax Mongolica did not eliminate conflict. It lowered the costs of movement and lifted the predictability of exchange. A merchant leaving Tabriz with dyed cloths and small metalwork could imagine the rate at which he would cover ground, the places where he would find lodgings without bargaining, the officials who would stamp his documents without insult or delay, and the markets where he would convert goods into coin. A monk from Europe could ride to a capital in the East and return with notes that read like early ethnography, lists of practices, recipes, ceremonies, and measurements. The names of visitors, Karpini, Rubruk, Polo, Barsauma, place markers along the same roads used by anonymous teams of drovers and scribes. Military method stayed recognizable even as it adapted to new tools. Composite bows remained a core. Horses and remounts sustained the pace. Discipline enabled complex tricks on the field. Feigned retreats worked because they were honest in form and deceptive in intent. The unit really did withdraw in good order and really did turn and tighten when the pursuer extended too far. Siege was no longer foreign to the steppe army. Engineers, sometimes Chinese, sometimes Persian, sometimes local to the besieged, prepared machines that hurled stones and fire. Sappers tunneled. Ladders went up under provision of covering fire. Coordination among moving parts replaced the reliance on any single dramatic charge.
Logistics made these efforts possible. Herd management ensured that cavalry retained speed without starving its mounts.
Light but nourishing staple foods, curds, dried meat, allowed a column to live off its own stores for days without relying entirely on the countryside. Horse blood mixed with milk, a last resort resource, entered the cultural memory not as cruelty, but as proof of a willingness to do what was necessary to arrive where orders commanded. The yams served not only messages, but also planners who sent couriers ahead to arrange grain and fodder. Campaigns were calendars with legs. Everything had a time and a place, and the two were matched by habit. Psychological warfare was policy, not accident. Stories of destruction traveled. Stories of spared cities traveled too. The result was a menu of choices for the defender. Resist and perhaps see your city made an example, or cooperate and receive a garrison and a schedule. The moral valence of these choices can be debated at length, but the practical effect was fewer sieges than the size of the empire might suggest, and more surrenders under terms. The policy was legible to friends and enemies alike. Legibility allowed quick decisions under pressure. The climate applied pressure that no general could outmaneuver. Shifts in temperature and rainfall altered grass yields, challenging the resource base upon which the early empire had depended. In bad years, horses needed more attention and more grazing. In good years, expansion and trade eased the strain. Settled agricultural regions faced their own cycles, with floods and droughts testing the adequacy of canal maintenance and granary reserves. Where administrators anticipated and mitigated, loyalty strengthened. Where they were slow or self-serving, unrest looked like a reasonable choice to those who suffered.
Disease exploited interconnection. The Black Death moved along caravan routes and boarded ships that connected Black Sea ports to the Mediterranean. Accounts vary in their details, but the pattern is consistent. Towns thinned, fields went untilled, and tax registers recorded sudden drops that scribes could barely explain in words. The empire's systems could slow but not stop the losses. Quarantines were attempted, prayers were said, inheritance disputes multiplied. The demographic impact translated into military and fiscal limits. Garrisons found themselves under strength. Supply contracts went unfilled. The yam itself had fewer riders. Succession disputes, always present in polities where bloodline and merit both claim authority, became sharper as the empire's breadth encouraged distance. Cousins born to different mothers and raised in different environments spoke with equal confidence about their rights. Factions formed around them and around the practical men, governors, generals, treasurers, whose bets on a claimant were both calculations and beliefs. Heavy-handed tax demands pushed by one faction might be used by another as proof of tyranny. The system that had once synchronized separate armies increasingly responded to local rhythms. In China, the Yuan administration felt the accumulation of difficulties. Floods damaged harvests, silver shortages tangled finance, officials rotated too often or not enough, failed to build trust. Secret societies formed, rebels recruited, and the Red Turban movement turned from rumor to presence. The shift from Yuan to Ming was not a single catastrophic collapse. It was a process of losing the benefit of the doubt, province by province, command by command, until the capital changed hands and northern banners withdrew. Some institutions survived the change. The canals still carried grain. The habit of using paper money informed new debates. The practice of registering households endured. Other items, social hierarchies that privileged some groups over others, entered memory as grievances rather than guides. In Persia, after capable Ilkhans died without clear successors, provinces reasserted older identities. Strong men and city elites negotiated arrangements that traded stability for autonomy. Caravans diverted when roads became unsafe and returned when new guards assured a fair toll. The intellectual scene never entirely dimmed. Libraries remained. Histories, some commissioned by the very rulers whose positions were precarious, were completed. preserving an account of the decades in which a distant steppe power had dictated the terms of order. The Golden Horde fragmented into successor states as political gravity pulled in new directions. The rise of Moscow and other centers shifted tributary relationships and altered the matrix of obligations that had once seemed permanent. Islam remained strong in the successor polities. Trade continued with adjustments, and the institutional habit of confirming princely authority with formal documents influenced the language and expectation of later administrations. The narrative of the Mongol yoke in the Slavic lands coexisted with a quieter narrative of administrative learning. The Chagatai realm also shifted, producing spaces where later conquerors, most notably Timur, drawing on Turco-Mongol traditions, would assemble coalitions and remarket older formulas for authority. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara benefited from the enduring logic of location. They sat where roads converged and rivers made oases possible, and their craftspeople and scholars kept the flame of continuity alive even when banner colors changed. The military legacy of the Mongol centuries reached beyond direct descendants. European commanders, Middle Eastern sultans, and Chinese generals absorbed the lesson that discipline multiplies bravery, that logistics decide battles, and that intelligence is cheap compared to ignorance. The decimal system inspired later reforms that sought clarity in command relationships. Siegecraft, once a guild of secrets, became a more widely taught art as practitioners moved and wrote. The practice of cultivating reputation as a tactical tool, every bit as real as a spear, entered the strategic vocabulary of many courts. Administrative legacies persisted in quieter ways. Empires later in time replicated censuses at regular intervals because they saw the value of having numbers that resisted exaggeration. Relay posts and standardized travel passes resurfaced across regions with new names. The idea that a law code should be known and enforced evenly, at least in theory, was reinforced by the Mongol insistence that warmakers obey rules, that theft be punished whether the thief was a common soldier or a favored captain, and that orders in writing could travel faster than suspicion. Economically, the long roads retained their habit of being open. Trade routes do not disappear when rulers change. They sag or tighten according to policy. The routes strengthened under Pax Mongolica survived because they made sense. The wares traded were not exotic luxuries alone. Everyday items, textiles, tools, paper, dried fruit, moved along with jeweled cups and lacquered boxes. Markets developed common understandings of weights and measures that lowered transaction costs and made exchange less personal and more institutional. These habits are the skeleton of durable commerce. Cultural effects can be traced in the lives of ordinary people. Loanwords sit quietly in languages where few notice them. Musical modes travel with instruments. Recipes hybridize, and what one generation calls foreign becomes a beloved family dish in the next. In Yuan, China, theater forms took on new vitality. In Central Asia, Persian literature became a second skin for Turkic-speaking elites. In the Slavic world, the cadence of charter and seal reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled. In Mongolia, the memory of the founder persisted through accents and ages, an emblem for unity and resilience even when political power lay elsewhere.
The genetic echo is a different register of history, read not in chronicles but in chromosomes. Studies in recent decades propose that a particular Y chromosome lineage expanded rapidly in the centuries after the Mongol conquests, plausibly linked to the extended family of the ruling house. Regardless of precise attribution, the broader point is consistent with the narrative of movement. People mixed at rates high enough to leave patterns visible centuries later. The human map of Eurasia was redrawn repeatedly, and some of those lines were boundaries, while others were family trees. The dual nature of the empire's legacy stands out when the long view is taken. The destruction of cities and the displacement of populations is unquestionable and should not be softened. At the same time, The administrative reforms and the protection of trade routes generated a different kind of stability, a zone in which written orders mattered, in which taxes were not improvised anew every season, and in which an artisan's skill might be recognized and relocated rather than extinguished. The coexistence of these two realities, hardness and order, makes the Mongol episode distinctive and instructive. If you picture the empire not as a line on a map, but as a rhythm, it becomes easier to understand its persistence and its limits. The rhythm is a pattern of movement and rest, of campaign seasons and tax cycles, of relay horses and census clerks, of feasts where loyalty is pledged and mournings when caravans depart because promises made the night before are kept in the daylight. The rhythm falters under plague and mismanagement. It strengthens under foresight and honest accounting. It is a rhythm that can be learned and imitated, which is why its traces appear in places that never flew a Mongol banner. The end of the empire as a single integrated structure did not end the story of its parts. Successor states in China, Persia, Central Asia, and the steppe adopted practices that still bear recognizable shapes. Ming administrators audited grain shipments with a seriousness that has cousins in earlier ledgers. Timurid architects raised domes that implied both inheritance and innovation. Muscovite princes weighed tribute in service with methods learned under an older order. Central Asian rulers listened to poets whose metaphors came from a world larger than their courts. The wind that once pressed on the felt of a great tent pressed instead on the tiled roofs of courts that knew they were standing on foundations packed by earlier hands. Throughout this long narrative, individuals mattered. Clever generals, upright officials, stubborn rebels, patient artisans. Yet the weight of institutions mattered more over time. A single leader can conquer a province. An institution can keep it working. The yam is only a line of posts and horses until men at each post do their duties without drama. Then it becomes a promise kept in chain form. The law is only words until magistrates decline to accept bribes and scribes file papers in places where they can be found. The decimal army is only a neat idea until soldiers understand that they are seen and will be rewarded or punished according to rules that do not change with the weather. There were failures. The hubris of assuming that sea and jungle would respond to tactics that worked on plains cost lives in coin. Experiments with currency that lacked public confidence produced inflation and distrust. Ethnic hierarchies within the Yuan structure generated resentment that governors failed to alleviate. Ecological limits were sometimes ignored, and herds suffered. City courts, growing complacent, forgot that legitimacy is maintained by service, not merely asserted by decree. These errors did not negate the achievements, but they shortened horizons and quickened decline. It is useful, too, to remember how much of the empire's success depended on information. Scouts who returned with accurate reports saved armies days of searching for water or weak points. Market officials who listened to traders could adjust policies to reduce smuggling and increase declared sales. Diplomats who learned languages shortened negotiations and lengthened truces. The entire enterprise was a vast experiment in how far knowledge can travel before it becomes stale, and how quickly a decision made in a capital can remap practice on a frontier. The enduring fascination of the Mongol Empire lies in its scale and in its paradoxes. A society rooted in pastoral movement mastered and improved sedentary institutions. An army famous for speed learned patience at walls. A ruling house that could be merciless in war could be reliably tolerant in worship and reformist in administration. The global history that followed carries imprints from these contradictions. European military thinkers re-examined cavalry. Islamic jurists digested a century of unusual cases and produced opinions that broadened the tradition's reach. Chinese fiscal administrators tested paper instruments under stress and recorded exactly what happened when confidence and coercion met.
When we speak of the Silk Road flourishing under Mongol protection, we should picture more than silk. We should imagine bales of cotton, sacks of pepper, books of paper, bundles of furs, bars of metal, strings of beads, jars of oil. We should imagine guides who knew which wells were sweet and which were brackish, innkeepers who kept fresh bedding in one room and a ledger in another, border officials who checked seals and wrote receipts, and riders who carried clarifications so that a dispute could be settled before it became a feud. We should imagine most of all the quiet confidence of those who set out, because they believed that the route had been made ordinary, and in the ordinary lay its safety. Decline was gradual because the habits built in stronger times took time to unwind. Relay posts did not vanish the day a border shifted. Scribes did not forget where they put the census volumes. Merchants did not throw away their scales. In this inertia, there was comfort and danger. Comfort because systems could carry on through a generation of confusion. Danger because the illusion of stability sometimes delayed necessary reforms. The Mongol centuries teach this, that good systems are durable but not immortal, and that institutions live only as long as the people inside them keep small promises.
In the countries that remember being under Mongol rule, the memory has many tones. In Mongolia, the founder is revered as the architect of identity and strength. In China, the Yuan is remembered for both disruption and cultural flowering. In Iran and its neighbors, the destruction of cities lives in memory alongside the patronage of scholarship and the adjustment to Islam that turned conquerors into guardians. In the Slavic lands, the Mongol period is both a hardship and a teacher, blamed for delays in some developments and credited for the centralizing habits that made later achievements possible. In Central Asia, the mingling of identities under Chinggisid legitimacy remains a usable past for rulers who need a thread that ties their authority to something older than any contemporary faction. A last reflection returns to the steppe. The environment that forged the early Mongols was not an accident. It rewarded resilience, planning, and mobility. It discouraged complacency. These attributes explained much of what came later. The empire's structure scaled those attributes into law and road, garrison and ledger. When the world changed, when climate faltered, when plague carried away the population that paid taxes and cropped fields, the same attributes supported adaptive retreats. The people who packed a tent in the morning and set it again in the evening understood that endurance sometimes looks like staying in place and sometimes looks like moving on. What remains for us is not a call to emulate conquest, but a reminder to build systems that make cooperation predictable and travel safe. The yam is a principle as much as a place. The yasa a commitment as much as a code. The decimal army is a lesson in clarity and the portability of organization. The tolerance practiced for reasons of state demonstrates that pluralism can be a policy as well as a sentiment. These are legacies that can be detached from their violent origins and applied to challenges that require scale and coordination without conquest. If you have listened this far, the names and dates may have softened into a background pattern, and that is appropriate. The details can be retrieved when needed. Their shape remains as a slow outline of how order can be drawn across distance, how power can be tamed by procedure, and how decline does not erase the utility of what was once well made. The horses are gone from the roads, and where posts once stood for riders, there are other networks and other messages gliding between stations. Yet the logic is recognizable. Speed matters, trust matters, law matters, and in the spaces between, people do their quiet jobs so that strangers can meet and make agreements that benefit more than themselves. This is a long story told in a calm register, and its calmness is appropriate. The empire that began in tents did not end in a single fire. It eased out into successor realms, and then into institutions carried by those who had lived under it. Others replaced it. New ideas arose. The maps changed. But on certain days, when a reliable service connects distant places, or when the law applies unremarkably to those who expected special treatment, or when merchants pass without being shaken down at each gate, you can sense the echo of a time when someone decided that rules would be written so that distances would be less cruel. Thank you for staying with this measured account of the Mongol Empire's rise, order, and afterlife. The tale has moved from the grasslands to the cities, from battles to budgets, from personal loyalties to public law, always in an even voice. If you close your eyes now, let the quiet logic of relay posts, road guards, ledgers, and predictable laws remain as the final image, a network built to shrink uncertainty in a very large world. May the steadiness of that image bring you rest, and may the memory of this long, gentle journey be waiting when you choose to return.